we are back with our new videocast series, Beyond the IT Headlines, where we go beyond the press releases and explain what's really happening in the world of IT and data, but more specifically what it means for your business. We expect to publish these bi-weekly with a focus on pushing the narrative beyond the headlines with different guests and provocative points of view. I'm Sean Rosemarin, and today's topic, while governments are increasingly positioning themselves as active players in AI. They're developing in-house models, they're buying infrastructure, and they're instituting policies to ensure security, economic independence, and cultural alignment. This AI sovereignty trend is crucial, yet underexplored. Today we're going to drive into it and why it matters and what it means when states and governments become AI powerhouses. Because ultimately, these powerhouses are building their own sovereign data planes, their own sovereign data governance, with their own storage, their own keys, their own networks, to make sure that they keep sensitive data lawful, performant, and recoverable. Today, we're going to decode what that means for CDOs, chief data officers, and app owners who are designing data platforms for this government data sovereignty era. Today, it's my absolute pleasure to have with me Valerie Harrison. So Valerie, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Hey, Sean, thanks for having me. As Sean said, I'm Valerie Harrison. I'm a principal technologist, lately at Pure Storage. I spent a few years at Google Cloud, as well as some of the larger OEMs. And I've been in the technology industry about 25 years, so I've seen a lot of stuff.
All right, so let's jump right in. I mean, obviously, the early stages of AI, we saw the hyperscalers really jumping out in front, procuring, we talked about this on a past episode, procuring hundreds of billions of dollars of capital. But the fact is, beyond regulation, governments are jumping in as well, but they're building it on their own terms. And we're kind of seeing this concept of national sovereignty being the next frontier of tech power. So I don't know, from your point of view, what are we seeing here? What's really happening?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely, they're seeing a focus on building that for not only for economic reasons, security reasons, but also for cultural and linguistic identity reasons. This is really becoming part of a national ethos and part of their drive to become more, have better competition and have technical sovereignty.
So why is this so important, though? Why would the government not just go and say, hey, you know what, hyperscaler XYZ, build a facility on my site and we'll do business with you? Why is it so important that they take an active role in the build out, not just the regulation, but the build out of the infrastructure and the AI stack itself?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been talking about GDPR for a long time now. It became implemented in 2018. So we've been having these conversations around data residency. But as you look at the entire stack, and as you start to increasingly have things like metadata, system data, et cetera, that are becoming part of these sovereign clouds, having someone just come in and build infrastructure really is just a very limited part of the entire scope and ecosystem of what you're looking at. And a lot of times, I'm going to be honest, having come from the cloud, a lot of time cloud providers, they don't want to have skin in that game. They have their own infrastructures that they want to support. They don't want to come build it for a company. They want to bring you into their ecosystem where they can get the scale that they're used to.
Okay, so let me jump on. You mentioned GDPR, and obviously that was the first piece of regulation relating to that's a general data privacy regulation. Essentially, in a nutshell, allows individuals to be forgotten by the cloud. Ask for the data
to be
removed.
Forgotten.
But actually, this year we saw the first Data Act in the EU, in the European Union, and this EU Data Act, which actually becomes applicable or became applicable in September, changes how data access portability and cloud switching has to work. This is hugely impactful.
Sure.
And, the core components of the act touch all kinds of I'll call it data stewardship, from what's collected in IoT, how businesses share it, how they share it with the government, how switch traffic functions, whether or not bits can go over the border or must stay within the border on, call it a walled off network, how international authorities can access that data and under what conditions, as well as smart contracts. So essentially how this data is leveraged within the contract. So if you're a government entity, and remember, ultimately, governments don't have the budgets that hyperscalers do to hire these kind of engineering skills necessary to stand this up. How do you think about it? If you're sitting being asked to make sure you have controls and stewardship over all this, but without necessarily having the budget or the skills to make it happen?
Yeah, I mean, partnerships are going to be critical. I think, the thought was, hey, we're going to build this walled off garden and it's going to be this sovereign place and nothing can come in or come out. It's very highly regulated. But when you do that, you lose a few things. First off, you lose scale. You lose cooperation with other companies or other countries where you could actually get better leverage. And you lose the ability to have that global reach. And so I think, when you talk about sovereignty, it's around controls and it's about making sure that you have clearly stated goals around what you're trying to achieve, but realizing that you can't build an island and have yourself doing everything. And you have to have sovereignty built into everything, again, as a strategic control, including things like the contracts that you sign with your vendors, whether it's people who put the tech on your floor if you're running it on-prem in your country, or with the companies that you're having as providers, whether they're a hyperscaler or a SaaS provider. Those contracts have to specifically indicate that they are going to follow the policy and the controls that you need.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're using the word sovereignty a lot, and I think we do throw it around a lot. I want to dig a little bit into that. So let's just sort of break down sovereignty. Let's first talk about data sovereignty. So from your point of view,
Sure.
I mean, look, if I use hyperbole, this talks about residency and classification and lineage and retention and backup. But what does data sovereignty actually mean?
Well, for me, if you look at the word sovereignty, it really means control, I think. I mean, it's understanding what the data is, where it is. And it goes back to something that I've been working on for quite a few years now around data governance. When I fairly recently had an interview and they were like, well, what is one of the most critical things you see in the future of data? And I was like, I think data governance is one of the most critical things. Understanding not only like where it is. I think chief data officers, one of the things they struggle with most is, I call it dude, where's my data? Like they don't know where their data is, understanding where it is. Classification becomes increasingly difficult, is a very labor intensive process. Having stewardship, so people that understand the lineage of data, where it's coming from. And then, there is no AI without data. I keep saying that all the time. There's no analytics without data. When you talk about security, the most secure computer is one that's turned off. It's also the most useless computer. So having data, you want to be able to use it. You don't store data just to have it. You store data to use it. So understanding controls becomes incredibly important because you want to use your data for your priorities.
Yeah, I want to press on data sovereignty, though, because this can get quite complicated. I mean, in the old world, it was kind of like I had my databases and I knew where they were. And if I had to delete something, I deleted it. Or if I had to encrypt something, I encrypted it. But it sounds like here, if I use data to prepare a model for training, and then I issue that training model out for inference, I need to know where every individual record came from that made up that training library. And I potentially need to be able to delete that out of my training library, in essence, performing a lobotomy on my training set, and then re-rag that data if I can't prove the lineage. I mean, this could actually present some pretty significant challenges for governments as they build this out.
100%, because most governments are not building their own models. The foundational models that we're talking about, the large language models, these are being built by PhDs at tech companies. And when you introduce bias or you introduce cultural specificity into a model, it is going to be less relevant for your use case, especially if it's one around national identity. So that is a huge challenge for companies because, I'm going to be honest, I've not seen anyone be very transparent around what kind of training data companies use for their large language models. That is their intellectual property, and they're not going to usually be very transparent about that.
Well, and as if data sovereignty wasn't complex enough to begin with, now there's this whole discussion of key sovereignty, right? Which obviously are encryption keys. And this has become incredibly complex because we've now moved to bring your own key. Other various key models where essentially governments want the opportunity at any point to revoke keys or constituents revoke
Mm-hmm.
keys, thereby making the data no longer accessible. And so, from a security and encryption perspective, this key sovereignty is actually forcing governments to rethink their architectures as well.
Absolutely. Yes. And that, again, it's becoming an ever increasingly complex world, trying to maintain all of this control.
Yeah, I mean, you look at data sovereignty and key sovereignty, and then it even extends to operational sovereignty. So there's even controls being put in place that say people who are non-nationals can't operate the platform. They can't access the platform.
Yes.
They can't get into the nuts of the platform. And so,
yes, and I've worked with customers just like that. I've worked with large manufacturing companies where they operate globally, but yet they have to, in a way, operate in very siloed and make sure that the data is being touched by people who are in geo.
So now we get into skills challenges in some of the smaller regions or smaller countries where how do you ensure that, citizenship is in place? We've seen this in, high confidentiality or high security government institutions for a while. But if we now talk about the generic sovereign cloud for a given country and the amount of people, hands and legs that you need to run these things, this could become a pretty major challenge.
Well, especially when you consider a lot of, my background is a lot in manufacturing, so I'll use that as an example. A lot of manufacturing companies are biased toward going to low-cost countries for things like engineering, but they may not have talent around data, around security and things like that, but yet they have data that they produce and access in region. So that becomes an additional wrinkle. And does that add to the cost of something they're trying to do at low cost?
Well, I think it does. Not only the day one cost, but the day two and beyond cost. Oh. And then that cost is obviously funded by taxpayers. And so what does that do to our tax base as citizens in terms of, is the juice worth the squeeze? Is all this effort going to actually drive enough benefit to the average citizen that it's worth the impact to the financials of the region?
Yes.
But let's use that as a jump off point. Look, the hyperscalers are not looking at this and standing still. So if you just look at what's happening in the news today, AWS has built a European Sovereign Council. They've claimed and committed to independent EU-only operations. They're going to stand up their first region in Brandenburg by the end of 2025 with dedicated European networking, dedicated European DNS. You've also got Microsoft setting up their EU data boundary, committing to keep customer and personal data within the EU. And then you got Google and T-Systems partnering up for their sovereign cloud in Germany, as well as Thales and Google in France, with local operators getting back once again to operational sovereignty and EKM patterns. So, as if that wasn't complicated enough, you've also got national models. And so I want, for those listening along that are saying, how far along are we in this? Clearly we got Stargate in the US that's developing, that's kind of pushing along. You've also got Japan's Fugaka LLM built on their national cloud, Netherlands building out their GPT-NL in their sovereign cloud, and then the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, with Falcon 2 building their own model. So when you're thinking about this as an architect, you're saying I can go with hyperscalers, I can build my own, I can do a public-private partnership. Where's your head at in all this?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we talked about a walled garden or an island. And again, I feel like, being pragmatic is incredibly important. Really taking a stake on what you have. To your point, how much money do we want to spend on this? Is that aligned with our priorities as well as actually doing the thing? A lot of times, I believe the future is going to be hybrid. People are going to put, and I've worked with companies forever. I worked with, again, large manufacturing companies who have decided that they want to make sure their apps and their data are in the right place for where they're going to be used. And I think as we move into sovereign clouds, that's going to have to be a decision as well. Data has gravity. We've talked about that for a while. So are there opportunities to build sovereignty in-house? Leveraging some strategic partnerships to bring talent in and do that. Are there things that the cloud offer that they can do uniquely at scale as a managed service? And the value is you're going to get their expertise and not have to try to find the talent. And so making sure that your priorities align to what and where you're doing it is going to be critical, because there's not one solid answer.
Yeah, I love what you said there. The future is hybrid. And then you talked about data gravity. And once again, it's a term we throw around very often. But maybe just explain to our audience. I mean, ultimately, how does data gravity play into all this? And to your hybrid statement, why does data gravity essentially force us towards a hybrid architecture?
Yeah, I mean, I can't tell you how many times I say there is no AI without data. Data is actually the absolute most important component of trying to do any kind of AI and analytics. But at the scale where we're talking about AI, it's a lot of data. And much like a black hole, data has gravity and it tends to suck the users in, it tends to suck the applications in. So you'll see things like people trying to do engineering use cases where they have large amounts of data. You can't bring the data to the engineers. You have to bring the engineers to the data at a certain scale. So they're facing those challenges. And so as you realize that data mobility becomes a networking problem, and physics is a thing, like speed of light only goes so fast. So understanding that when you're trying to move data around, you're probably going to lose at the end of the day against physics. You can't fight physics. So understanding that when you have large piles of data that you want to get analyzed, that you need to use to inform an AI strategy, some of that scale, you're going to have to build around it rather than move it to a cloud, right? I mean, as you're generating net new, hey, the sky's the limit. But, increasingly, we have a lot of data that we want to action on that's already in existence. We got to make sure that we can build the infrastructure around that data.
Yeah, we created this problem. We started to build applications in all sorts of different places, not just our own places, but cloud places, MSP places. And now that data lives there. And data gravity basically says whatever services I want to consume that data, I have to build there as well. Otherwise, I got to basically move terabytes, petabytes, exabytes, yottabytes of data. And if that data is changing, that can be quite a complex manner. And I do agree with you, unless we can speed up how light travels at this point. That is a pretty serious constraint.
Yeah, I was working with another customer who was looking at, exabytes of data, and we did some calculations, and it would been, I think it was 5 years it was going to take to move that data into the cloud. Like, you can't action on that data. That's impossible.
Oh, you got to just back up a big truck, right? A 16-wheeler. And pile the data into the 16-wheeler and drive it or fly it across the country, around the world. Those are real challenges. So let's talk about some of the risks and challenges, and let's kind of try to round this out. We know why governments want to do it. We know there's policy in place to do it. We know that there's multiple options for them to do it. Let's just dive a little bit into the risks and challenges here. So obviously, we've got fragmentation. So we've got kind of all of these various data sets living in all of these places that need to be governed by a single policy. We've got encryption and key management as a challenge. We've got protectionism versus innovation, some countries more than others, but protectionist policies are a thing. We've got governance risk, every government having different controls on the data that they are using and the data that they're sharing. Let's just call it within the G7. Let's call it within any of the large government collaborations. And then we've got resilience and auditability, cyber frameworks popping up all over the place. So what's your advice, Valerie, when governments go deep with sovereign AI? How do they kind of balance this walled off system problem with, also instilling cross-border cooperation and letting the largest governments in the world actually learn and share with one another in an efficient way?
Yeah, and it's a huge trade-off. I mean, obviously, we talked about this at Accelerate. This is a season of uncertainty. Things are changing. Today's ally could be your potential adversary. There is this sense of, co-opetition. I'm competing economically, but yet I need some of your data, or I want to get leverage of scale. Different national regulatory frameworks, they differ from region to region. So trying to navigate that becomes incredibly difficult. And then, of course, also, depends on foreign tech. So most of the countries depend upon NVIDIA for a lot of their GPU tech. That is a foreign piece of equipment, and navigating that becomes incredibly difficult. But again, it goes back to the idea of control. How can you build in controls for these, whether it's access, whether it's keys, especially contracts when it comes to partnerships? Because again, nobody can really no one can do it alone. In the days of AI, where the scale is so huge, no one can do it alone. And making sure that you have your goals clearly laid out, making sure that you have the controls clearly stated, and then making sure the contracts and the partnerships that you have align with those goals and are clearly stated to protect yourself. I think that helps.
Yeah, this is where this encryption becomes so important, because ultimately, if I'm a government and I own the keys to my data and I choose to share that data, I still hold the keys. So if at any point, to your discussion of, friends versus foes, if at any point I want to revoke that data, I essentially just pull back the keys, and you no longer have access to that data. But let's not kind of, let's not dance around the bush. Bring your own key is a complicated architecture. It requires significant changes to the way that you manage data. And look, there's a lot of moving parts here, right? We've got big economies, the US, China, India, the Arab nations kind of continuing to build up strength here. You've also got, legislative moves and, bipartisan push. You talked about NVIDIA, kind of what's going on with their access or their delivery of systems to China, where that ends up. You've also got kind of the mid players. So if I think just within the G7, you've got countries like Australia and countries like Canada that are kind of aligning to say, hey, look, if we take 3 or 4 mid-sized countries and we build a fundamental, strong policy, we show leadership here, can we actually teach something to the largest nations? And so, what stands out in my mind is just how long is this going to take? And I'd love your sense of what do you think we're going to see over the coming years in this space? And ultimately, where are some of your thoughts around what some of the key markers and key things to watch as we're trying to figure out how this plays out?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think sometimes the larger countries have a problem of, it's the Titanic. Turning the Titanic is very hard. I think some of the other countries that are smaller, a little more nimble, could lay out some frameworks. I think that Europe has done a lot more around AI and things around. At the end of the day, not to take us off on a tangent, but there's other things around trust and bias and making sure that us humans trust in the AI. There's a lot of concerns there as well as we're spending money on this. So I think some of the smaller or mid-sized countries could kind of at least build a framework of what that might look like. What does cooperation look like? What are the frameworks that we put in place and the agreements we put in place to make sure that that we have that control? And I see, unfortunately, I see the U.S. as being a little bit of a laggard in this area. I think we're going to have to look at patterns from other countries as they build this out and see what's successful. So I think, to your point, we're going to look for other countries to kind of lead the way because it's going to be easier for them. It's going to be a little bit less of a monumental task.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Today we've talked a lot about sort of the technology and the cultural implications. I want to kind of round us out with, let's talk about the social and ethical implications. So as citizens of all this, where our governments are using our data and leveraging our data to improve the lives of everyone in the country, what are your thoughts there? I mean, what are some of the landmines the government really has to operate around as it brings these technologies to bear? When you think about, you've got a large citizenship with a large swath of different viewpoints. What do you think about that?
How much time we got? I could go on forever, but I'll try to be succinct. I think that's incredibly important. I would argue, and I think a lot of people agree with me, when you start to put in bias in AI, it becomes less accurate. I think when you have bias in AI and you have AI that's not aligned to your values, you start to lose the trust of the citizens and the people who use it, who you're trying to make their lives better. You can go back in history and look at the saboteurs who broke the machines because they didn't trust what it was going to do for their jobs. I think that countries, as they move into wholesale AI and utilizing citizen data, they're going to have to be transparent about how they use the data. They're going to have to be transparent about their goals and really make sure that whatever partnerships they make, the foundational models they use, how they use the data, really aligns to the values of their citizens and get alignment there, because otherwise you're not going to have the trust. And at the end of the day, if you don't have trust in a system, it's not useful.
Yeah, I want to build on that for just a moment, right? I mean, it's easy for us to all sit back and say, oh, Big Brother is watching, and now all my data is being connected, being pulled together. But I just want to remind folks, today, Uber knows where I live. DoorDash knows where I live. Waze knows where I live. Apple knows where I live.
Yes.
And I'm very conscious of it. I may not be comfortable with it, but I'm very conscious of it. But I trust them because they haven't given me a reason not to trust them. They haven't shown me that they're using my data in any kind of a nefarious way. And I do think governments today, have the challenge to not just make sure that they have policies in place to treat the data with the appropriate care, but also show that in giving up that privacy, you're gaining enough benefit, to my point around Uber and DoorDash and Waze and Apple, that I'm willing to give it to you because the benefit is greater than the perceived threat of me giving up that information. So the good news is this has been done before, but I do think it's going to take a lot more transparent communication with governments. So let's wrap up the segment. Maybe for our audience here, give us the 60-second rubric. What are the 5 kind of questions that every CDO within the government should be thinking about as they enter the funding stages of this next AI sprint and the build out to sovereign cloud?
Sure. And we talked about this. Number one, we talked about where's your data? Can you locate your data? Can you find it? Where is it living? Is it classified? Do you know what it is and what you're doing with it? Who controls that data? Who is actually the steward of the data? Who controls the keys and the operations? Who's actually touching the systems? Are we aligning with trusted partners and allies? Or is it someone who's a future risk? Are you going to build in additional controls in the way to get the data back if things change? We talked about this as well, like what are we inheriting from that model's training data? We don't have a control a lot. I know some countries are building their own. A lot of countries aren't. If we don't have control, how do we ensure that they're aligned to our values and our priorities? And then are we building on a platform that's shareable, that's accessible, that's scalable, or are we building a splinter net in a little island that can only do a very narrow use case and doesn't expand for the expanding use cases of AI?
As you think about this, it's kind of this whole subject of cooperation, right? I mean, I hate to bring us back to the pandemic from many years ago, but one of the reasons we were able to work through the pandemic as quickly as we did was governments built very clear networks for cooperation. And I do think as the sovereign cloud builds out, it's also going to require very clear connections. We don't need every country to solve the same problem in their own way. They need to help each other in learning from what they've developed. And although the models themselves might be different, this concept of collaboration and cooperation is going to be key. And that's going to come down to reference architectures. It's going to come down to models. It's going to come down to data stewardship. It's going to come down to key management. But there's a playbook here. And I do think that, between public and private interactions, whether that be with companies like Pure or Microsoft or Google or Amazon or others, I do think that we can accelerate this by working together as opposed to everybody sort of walling off. But the last point, and I don't want to kind of, skirt past this, is we also have to ask ourselves how much of the existing data is actually usable, not just from a legal standpoint, not just from a governance standpoint. How much of the data is actually accurate? Because the biggest risk here is we go for the biggest swath of data. We try to mine and train off everything, but we end up actually polluting our training models in the process. So I don't know, any thoughts on that in terms of when you're looking at these data estates around the world and the governments would have some of the largest ones?
Oh, 100%. I think about this so much. And that's why I keep going back. I keep saying data governance. It's not just an application. It's not just a process. It's a whole ecosystem of how you manage your data, how you cleanse your data, how you establish lineage. And I think that as the tools and the infrastructure gets smarter, they get more performant, we have the ability to go back and start to do that classification and doing it in an automated way. So, for example, using large language models to help analyze the data, surface metadata, do some cleansing. So it's not so much human intensive. I think those really give us an opportunity to do better governance and have better lineage so that we, to your point, we're not training on garbage. We're training on things that are meaningful and also that are controllable. Again, if you have data sovereignty, you have GDPR, right to be forgotten, you got to know what data you have on people before you can action on that. So I think the tools that we have and the infrastructure that we have is increasingly allowing us to be able to do that in a more scalable way.
Yeah, I mean, you've definitely given us a lot to think about. Clearly, this is an area you're spending a lot of time on discussions. For our audience here, how can they reach you? And if folks want to reach out, where are you accessible?
Sure, yeah. My social media of choice is LinkedIn, so I'm all over LinkedIn posting pictures of customer visits and my dog occasionally. So I'm definitely on LinkedIn. My email address is vharrison@purestorage.com. I welcome any and all interaction. Love to talk, especially with customers who are having challenges. I love to hear what you're doing. It really informs how I think about the world. So thank you for that.
Well, and thank you, Valerie. And so on behalf of Valerie, I'm Sean Rosemary. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Beyond IT Headlines, and we'll see you all in a couple weeks.